transition room. This is episode 4. Can't believe it, we're at the fourth episode already. And today we're stepping into a question that many professionals carry quietly for a long time. A question that usually appears long before any visible change happens. The question is simple: should I leave? Or is this just a phase? From the outside, many careers look perfectly stable: good role, good team, clear trajectory. If someone looked at your LinkedIn profile, they would probably assume things are going well. But privately, a question keeps returning. It's not loud, just somewhere in the background. Should I stay? Or is it the time to leave? And what makes that question difficult is not the lack of clarity. Very often, people already sense the answer. What makes it difficult is everything the answer might disrupt. It could be income, it could be security, it could be expectations from the people around you, and sometimes even the identity you've spent years building.
Most people assume career decisions get delayed because someone lacks clarity. But that's rarely what's happening. In many cases, the clarity arrives much earlier than the actions. Someone senses that something about their work has shifted, but acting on that realization immediately opens a completely different set of questions.
One of those is consequences, because the moment you admit that something might no longer be aligned, reality appears quickly. What happens to my stability? What happens to the path I've spent years building? What happens to that version of myself that people have come to know? And suddenly, the question is no longer about work, it becomes a question about risk.
And that's why so many capable professionals stay in that space for a very long time. Not because they're confused, not because they're incapable of making decisions, but because they understand what change might cost them. And the mind naturally slows down when the consequences of a decision become significant.
There's actually a name for that space: the space between awareness and action. We call it decision friction. It's the inevitable, invisible tension that appears when clarity arrives. But acting on that clarity begins to disrupt stability.
And the decision friction is much more common than people actually realize, especially among capable professionals. People who have spent years building competence, their reputation, and stability. Because the more someone has built something, the more careful they are about changing the direction.
So, today, that's what we're exploring together: why capable professionals often stay longer than expected, how to recognize whether what you're experiencing is a temporary phase or a deeper misalignment, and why sometimes the hardest part of a transition is not finding the answer. It's accepting the one you may already know. So, before we continue, take a quiet moment and ask yourself something. What is one decision in your career or life that you've been postponing for more than, say, 3 months? Not a small task, a real decision. Just hold that question in your mind as we continue. Because very often the issue is not whether we know the answer, the issue is what we believe it will cost us to act on it.
Let's stay with this idea of decision friction for a moment. Because when people say they are stuck in their careers, they are not often describing it as a confusion. It's something much more simpler. We call it inertia. And inertia is very natural human experience. The longer we stay in a certain role or environment or identity, the more normal it begins to feel, even if something inside us has started to shift.
Many professionals assume that if they were truly unhappy, they would simply make a change. But that's not usually how human decision making actually works. Most people don't move the moment they feel discomfort. They first observe, they wait, they even try to understand whether what they're feeling is temporary or actually something deeper.
That actually reminds me of a conversation I had with someone recently. Let's call her Neha. Neha was about 10 years into her career. Strong reputation, reliable performer, the person people called when something complicated needed to get done. Her projects delivered, her team trusted her. Her manager relied on her. From the outside, everything about her career looked stable and golden. Good role, good teams, clear trajectory. And if you looked only at the external signals, you would assume she was exactly where she was supposed to be.
But something interesting had started happening internally. There wasn't a dramatic moment where Neha suddenly decided she wanted to leave. It appeared much more quietly than that. After a project that once would have her excited, but this time it felt more like routine. After a leadership meeting where she noticed she was listening but not really engaged in the conversation. After a few evenings where she actually realized she felt more relief leaving work than satisfaction actually finishing it.
None of those moments looked dramatic on their own, right? But together they started forming a signal. And that's often how awareness begins for many professionals. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet thought that appears for the first time. Is this still the work I want to keep doing?
And when that thought first appears, most people would dismiss it. Even I did. Because everything around them suggests they're doing well. Their performance reviews are strong, their team depends on them, their manager trusts them. So the easiest explanation becomes the most comforting one. Maybe I'm just tired. Maybe this quarter has been unusually intense. Maybe I just need a break.
And sometimes those explanations could be correct. Work can be demanding, careers go through intense phases. But the reason this moment matters is because once awareness appears, another force enters the picture, which is stability.
Because by the stage of that career, someone has usually built much more than just a job. You've actually built a reputation, a predictable income, relationships with colleagues, a professional identity, if you say. And all of those things create stability, and stability is valuable.
And also, that means that the mind begins to do a quiet calculation. Even if something feels slightly misaligned, it says, is it worth disrupting everything that already works? And very often the answer becomes, hmm, maybe not right now.
And what's interesting is that maybe not right now often becomes a pattern, not a decision, just a delay. Because the mind isn't saying no, it's just saying not yet.
And the problem with that not yet is that it feels responsible. It feels like you're being thoughtful. It feels like you are giving yourself time to think things through. But if you look closely sometimes, that not yet quietly turns into not at all without a clear decision being ever made.
And that's where people often get stuck for longer than they expected. Not because they chose to stay consciously, but because they kept postponing the moment of clarity.
Psychologists sometimes describe this as stability bias. It's the tendency to protect the structure we have already built, even when parts of that structure may no longer feel aligned, because the mind naturally prefers knowing environments over uncertain ones, even when the known environment is not perfect.
But it's important to say something here. Staying isn't automatically the wrong decision. Sometimes staying is thoughtful, sometimes staying is responsible, and sometimes staying gives someone time to actually prepare for a transition.
And that's why there are actually two different reasons someone might stay in the same role. The first is stability bias, where someone stays mainly because the change feels uncomfortable. But the second reason is something very different: strategic patience.
Strategic patience means someone already senses that a transition may happen eventually, but they're using the time intentionally. They may be building financial stability, learning new skills, exploring different directions, but quietly, preparing for a future shift rather than avoiding it.
And from the outside, those two situations can look identical. In both cases, someone continues in the same role. They show up, they perform, their career appears stable. But internally, the motivation behind staying can be completely different.
So, here's a moment to pause and look honestly at your own situation. Ask yourself something simple. Are you staying because this role still supports the direction you want to move in? Or are you staying because the idea of change feels uncomfortable right now? Just notice what comes up because sometimes clarity begins the moment we can tell the difference.
And when someone starts noticing that difference, another layer of experience usually becomes visible. The conflict is not only happening in their environments, it is also happening inside them. And that's where the decision often becomes more complex.
And this is usually the moment when something else becomes visible. The conflict is not only happening outside of someone, it's also happening within. Because most of us are not driven by a single voice when we make decisions. We're usually navigating different internal perspectives at the exact same time.
And when Neha started paying attention to what she was feeling, she noticed something interesting. There wasn't just one reaction inside her, there were two. One part of her felt curious. It wondered what it might be to do the work that made her feel more meaningful again. Work that sparked that kind of energy she remembered feeling earlier in her career. But almost immediately, there's an other voice that appears, and that voice sounded very different.
And it probably said things like this: Be careful. You worked hard to get here. Don't risk something that's already stable. And suddenly the decision felt much more complicated because now it wasn't just about whether Neha wanted something different, it was about whether it was safe to do something different or safe to want to do something different.
A framework that helps explain this experience comes from a psychologist named Richard Schwartz. It's called the internal family system, or IFS. The idea is actually very simple. Instead of thinking of ourselves as having one consistent voice inside our mind, IFS suggests that we have different parts, and each part has a role, and each part is trying to protect us in some way.
For example, one part of someone might be focused on growth. That part might say, I want to learn something new. I want work that feels meaningful. I want to feel energized by what I'm doing again. That part is usually connected to curiosity, possibilities, and expansion.
But then there's another part that often appears very quickly, and that voice is focused on protection. It says things like, you have responsibilities. You can't just walk away from something that you have built and is stable. Think about everything you might lose. And in IFS, that protective voice is often described as manager.
And what's interesting is that this manager doesn't appear just once, it tends to repeat in slightly different ways and over time.
And the longer someone stays in the same environment, the stronger that voice can become. Because now it has more evidence. It can say, you're doing well here, people respect you here, why risk something that's already working?
Which is why this internal negotiation can start to feel super exhausting because it's not a one time decision. It's a conversation that keeps repeating quietly and in the background.
And that's often the moment when people start doubting themselves. They think, if I feel this way again and again, why haven't I figured it out yet?
Because the difficulty isn't coming from a lack of clarity. It's coming from the fact that both sides of the internal conversation are actually valid and both sides are trying to protect something important.
And the important thing to understand is that the manager isn't trying to block your growth, it's trying to protect your stability. It remembers the effort it took to build your career and your current life, the years of work, the sacrifices that you have made, the progress that you have got. So, when the possibility of change appears, it responds with caution.
Which means the internal conflict many professionals feel is not a sign that something is wrong with them. It's actually a sign that different parts of them care about different things. One part cares about expansion, another part cares about protection, and both those parts are trying to serve you.
There is another layer that often makes this negotiation even more complex, which is identity. Because over time, our work becomes connected to how we see ourselves, the role we play, the expertise we have developed, the way others rely on us.
So, when someone considers leaving a role, it's not only about changing the job. It can feel like stepping away from a version of yourself that you've spent years building. The person who knows how things work, the person others depend on, the person who is good at what they do. And that's why the decision often feels heavier than people actually expect. It's not just professional, it's also personal.
Exactly. And this is where people often begin negotiating with themselves. They say things like, maybe this is just a phase, or maybe I'm just tired, or maybe the project that comes next will feel different. Those thoughts are not irrational. They are the mind trying to find a path that protects stability while still leaving the room for possibilities.
So, if you're listening to this and recognizing something familiar, just notice the voices that appear when you think about change. Is there a part of you that feels curious about something different? And is there another part that immediately starts listing reasons why that might not be safe? Both of those voices usually have very good intentions. The question isn't which one is right. The question is simply learning to recognize that both exist. Because once we see that internal negotiation clearly, the decision often begins to feel less confusing.
And once someone recognizes that internal negotiation, a very natural question appears. Is this just a phase, or is it something actually misaligned?
And that question can be surprisingly difficult to answer because every job has difficult periods, stressful quarters, demanding projects, moments where motivation just drops. Those experiences are normal. They happen in almost every career.
And so the goal isn't to eliminate frustration. The goal is to understand what kind of signal that frustration represents. Is it temporary, or is it part of a deeper pattern? This is exactly where Neha found herself. She didn't hate her job, nothing dramatic had gone wrong, but the question kept returning.
And when a question keeps returning like that, it can help to understand something about how transitions actually work. A researcher named William Bridges described a stage that many people experience during periods of change. He called it the neutral zone.
The neutral zone is the space between an old identity and a new one. The old structure no longer feels fully meaningful, but the new direction hasn't become clear yet. And that space can feel very uncomfortable, even confusing, because from the outside, nothing dramatic may have changed. You're still doing the same work, you're still with the same people, following the same routines. But internally, something feels very different.
And during that phase, people often assume something is wrong. They think, maybe I'm just burnt out. Maybe I'm just ungrateful. Maybe this is just temporary. And sometimes those explanations are correct. But sometimes the discomfort is actually a signal that something deeper is shifting.
One way to begin recognizing the difference is to look for patterns instead of one specific moment. Temporary frustration often appears around events, a difficult project, a stressful quarter, a demanding stakeholder. And when those events pass, something important usually happens. Energy returns, curiosity returns, the work begins to feel meaningful again.
Structural misalignment behaves differently because it doesn't disappear when the situation improves. Even after the stressful project ends, even after the workload stabilizes, and even after the environment changes, the same quiet feeling returns.
Many professionals first notice it in small ways. They stop feeling curious about work. Things that once felt energizing begin to feel repetitive. The motivation that once appeared naturally now requires a lot of effort. And sometimes people try to solve this by resting, taking a vacation, stepping away for a few weeks.
And rest can help if the issue is exhaustion. But if the same feeling returns shortly after that break, or that rest, that's often a signal that the issue may not be fatigue. It may be alignment. So, let's pause for a moment and try something simple. Imagine that nothing about your role changed for the next 2 years. Same work, same environment, same trajectory. How would that feel? Take a moment with that question. Would that feel steady or would it actually feel heavy?
Sometimes imagining the future clearly helps us understand what the present is trying to tell us, because patterns often reveal truths that single moments cannot.
And by the time someone begins to see those patterns clearly, something interesting usually happens. They already sense the answer, but the decision still feels difficult. And that's where the final layer of this conversation begins. How do we reduce the friction between clarity and action?
And this is exactly where Neha found herself. Nothing was clearly wrong, but the same question kept returning. And over time, she realized something important. It wasn't just a difficult phase, it was a pattern she could no longer ignore.
By the time someone reaches this stage of reflection, something interesting is usually happening within. They've noticed the pattern, they've sensed the misalignment, they've thought about the consequences. And yet, the decision still hasn't happened.
And this is the moment when many professionals become frustrated with themselves. They start asking questions like, if I already know something isn't quite right, why am I still here? But the answer is usually very human. Because at this stage, the mind is negotiating between two powerful forces. One side is security, and the other side is your expansion.
Security represents everything someone has already built: the stable income, the predictable path, the professional identity that others recognize, the comfort of knowing how the system works. All of that creates psychological safety.
Expansion represents something very different: growth and possibility. The chance to explore work that feels more aligned. But expansion almost always comes with uncertainty. And uncertainty is something the human brain naturally tries to minimize.
So instead of making a sudden decision, many professionals begin negotiating with themselves. They say things like, maybe after this promotion, maybe after this year, maybe once the project is finished. And those agreements feel reasonable in that specific moment.
But sometimes it helps to shift the way we look at decisions itself, not by forcing ourselves to act immediately, but by asking better questions.
One question that can be surprisingly powerful is this: instead of asking, what happens if I leave? Ask yourself, what happens if I stay exactly where I am for another year?
And sometimes people avoid that question because it's quieter, but also more uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that nothing is happening.
Absolutely. Because staying doesn't always feel like a decision, it feels like doing nothing. But in reality, staying is also a choice and it has its own consequences.
Well, time passes either way, energy gets spent either which ways. And sometimes what people realize is that the cost of staying isn't immediate, it's gradual.
It shows up slowly: less curiosity, less energy, less engagement. And over time, that can become the new normal without anyone consciously choosing it.
And that's why this question matters, not to push yourself into action, but to become more aware of what your current path is actually creating over time.
And if you stay with that question a little longer, you'll begin to see the cost more clearly, not in financial or professional terms, but emotionally and energetically, in terms of time. Because sometimes the biggest risk is not change. Sometimes the bigger risk is remaining in a situation that quietly drains you over time.
Another perspective that can help is to stretch the timeline a little. Imagine looking back at this moment from 10 years in the future. Would you wish you had explored the question earlier? Or Would you feel satisfied that you stayed where you were? The longer horizon often reveals something interesting. The fears that feel overwhelming today sometimes looks much more smaller when viewed from a wider perspective.
And none of these questions forces a decision immediately. They're not even meant to, but they do something important. They reduce the friction between clarity and action. And sometimes that's enough to help someone take the next small step forward.
Because transitions rarely begin with a dramatic decision. They begin with something much more quieter, a moment where someone starts paying closer attention to what their experience is actually telling them.
So, as we come to the end of this conversation, let's return to the question we opened with. Should I leave, or is this just a phase? For many professionals, the question doesn't appear once, it appears quietly and then it returns, sometimes months and sometimes years later.
And what we explored today is that the space between the question and the decision is not a sign of weakness, it's something much more common. We named it decision friction because when awareness appears, several forces start interacting at the same time: awareness, consequences, identity. And those forces don't always resolve themselves immediately.
Because people need time to actually process what change might mean, what they might gain, and what they might lose, and what version of themselves they may need to become next.
But there is one thing that often begins to shift the process: honesty. Honesty about what you're actually experiencing. Honesty about whether the frustration you feel is temporary or whether it's a pattern that keeps returning.
And honesty about something even deeper, whether you're staying because the role still supports your growth or because the familiarity of the role feels safer than the uncertainty of change.
Because, again, transitions rarely begin with a dramatic decision. They begin with something much quieter, a moment where someone simply acknowledges to themselves something about this no longer fits.
And that moment doesn't force you to act immediately, but it does invite you to start paying attention to patterns, to energy, to the signals that your work gives you over time.
So, before we close today, we'll leave you with one final reflection. Think again about that question that brought you into this episode: should I leave or is this just a phase? And ask yourself something slightly different. Not like, do I have the courage to change right now? But am I being honest about what I already know?
Because clarity often arrives earlier than we expect. What takes longer is deciding what to do with it. This is the transition room, and transitions rarely begin with action, they begin with awareness. We'll see you in the next episode. Bye bye.